The sterile tang of antiseptic was the scent of control. For Alara Brooks, it was the smell of a world that made sense, a world of charts and vitals, of predictable outcomes and procedures followed with religious precision. In the controlled chaos of St. Jude's emergency room, she was an island of calm. Tonight, however, the tide was rising. It came not as a siren's wail, but as a silent, menacing wave. A phalanx of men in immaculate dark suits parted the sea of weekend drunks and flu patients. They moved with a predatory economy, their presence sucking the air from the room, lowering its temperature by 10 degrees. In their center, on a gurney pushed by panicked paramedics, was the eye of the storm. He was a masterpiece of contradictions. His suit, a Tom Ford by the look of its ruined lapel, was soaked in blood from a vicious wound on his shoulder, yet his posture was one of indignant stillness. His face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, his black hair swept back from a high forehead. But it was his eyes that held the room hostage. They were the color of ancient, dark amber, and they missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who owned every room he entered, even one where he was bleeding out. Beside the gurney, pacing with a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the linoleum floor, was a German shepherd. The dog was magnificent, a creature of pure muscle and disciplined power, its coat the color of sable and shadow. Its intelligent eyes were fixed on its master, and a line of white teeth was bared to any orderly who dared come too close. "The dog can't be in here," the charge nurse, a harried woman named Brenda, snapped. "Hospital policy. It's a contamination risk." One of the suited men, older than the others with a thin scar bisecting his eyebrow, turned his head slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "The dog stays." The words were not a request. They were a statement of fact, as immutable as gravity. The standoff thick in the air, a standoff between hospital policy and a power that clearly had no regard for it. The dog, sensing the tension, let out a sharp bark, its body coiled like a spring. A young resident took an involuntary step back. Alara watched, her hands automatically checking the saline drip she was adjusting. She wasn't afraid of the dog. She had grown up with them, understood their language of posture and sound. This animal wasn't rabid. It was loyal. It was guarding the only thing in the world that mattered to it. The man on the gurney shifted, a quiet hiss of pain escaping his lips, and the dog's growl deepened into a chesty rumble. "Someone needs to get control of that animal before we can treat him," Dr. Evans said, his voice tight. The scarred man made a move toward the dog, his hand outstretched. "Rye," he said, his voice a low command. But the dog was too agitated. It saw the white coats and the flurry of activity as a threat. It lunged, not at the scarred man, but toward a porter who had gotten too close, its teeth snapping shut inches from the man's arm. People screamed. Brenda flinched. Alara moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was instinct. She didn't run, didn't shout. She simply stepped into the space between the snarling dog and the terrified staff. She held up a hand, not in aggression, but as a calm barrier. She didn't look at the men in suits or the bleeding man on the gurney. She looked at the dog. She met its intelligent, frantic gaze. Her voice, when it came, was low and steady, pitched just for the animal's ears. It cut through the panic like a surgeon's scalpel. "Easy." It was just one word, but it was delivered with an absolute certainty, a quiet authority that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with understanding. The German shepherd stopped mid-snarl. Its ears twitched. It blinked, its head cocked as if processing a language it recognized in a place it didn't. The tension in its powerful shoulders eased by a fraction. It looked from Alara's calm, dark eyes to its master, then back again. A low whine replaced the growl. The silence that followed was profound. Every eye in the ER was on her. But Alara was only aware of one pair. The man on the gurney had lifted his head, his amber eyes fixed on her with a burning intensity that felt more dangerous than the dog's teeth. He saw her. Not as a nurse, not as a woman, but as the only person in the room who had commanded respect without demanding it. Dr. Evans cleared his throat, seizing the moment of quiet. All right, let's get him into trauma one.
Now.
As they wheeled him past, his gaze never left Alara's face. The dog, Rai, now paced calmly at the side of the gurney, his shoulder brushing the cold metal frame, a silent, furry sentinel. The crisis was over. Or Alara thought it was just beginning. That was the moment everything changed. She would spend months trying to pinpoint where her ordinary life ended and this new, terrifying one began, and it was always here, with one word. An hour later, after the man had been stabilized, the bullet removed from his shoulder, and a private wing of the hospital cleared out with a quiet, hefty donation, the scarred man found her. She was finishing her charting, the familiar rhythm of the keys a comfort. Mr. Ishikawa requires a private nurse for the duration of his recovery, the man said, his English perfect and without inflection. The hospital will assign one, Alara replied, not looking up. He has already chosen. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She knew before he said it. She looked up, meeting the man's flat, unreadable gaze. He asked for you, again, not a request. A summons. I have other patients. They will be reassigned. Your salary will be tripled. You will want for nothing. And you will not be in danger. The last part was meant to be reassuring, but it sounded like a threat. It was an acknowledgement that danger was the default state of their world. She thought of refusing. She could say no. She could quit her job, leave the city. But the image of those amber eyes, the sheer, absolute certainty in them, told her it wouldn't be that simple. Men like that didn't take no for an answer. They took what they wanted. And for some reason she couldn't possibly comprehend, Kaito Ishikawa wanted her. She walked down the hallway to the private wing, her sensible nursing shoes silent on the polished floor. The two guards outside the door were as still and imposing as statues. They didn't even look at her as they swung the heavy door open. The room was less a hospital room and more a suite at a 5-star hotel. The only signs of a medical facility were the 4 stand by the bed and the heart monitor beeping in a soft, steady rhythm. Kaito Ishikawa was propped up against a mountain of pillows, a fresh white bandage stark against the tan skin of his shoulder. The rest of him was covered by a silk sheet, but not before she saw it. The intricate, vibrant tapestry of ink that covered his chest and snaked up his neck, a swirling riot of dragons and cherry blossoms. Yakuza. The word screamed in her mind. The dog, Rai, was lying on a rug at the foot of the bed. When she entered, he lifted his head, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the floor. Kaito watched her approach, his face impassive. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He was assessing her, dissecting her with that unnerving gaze. She met it head-on, her professional mask firmly in place. I'm Alara Brooks, she said, her voice even. I'll be your nurse. He inclined his head, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible. I know. His voice was a low baritone, smooth like aged whiskey, but with an edge of broken glass. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. The first few days were a study in tension. Alara moved through her duties with a detached professionalism that was her armor. She checked his vitals, changed his dressing, administered his medication, and documented everything. She spoke only when necessary, her questions concise and clinical. He, in turn, was a model patient in the way a caged tiger might be. He was still, silent, and watchful. He never complained of pain, never asked for anything. He simply observed her every move. The dog was the bridge between their two silent worlds. Rai seemed to have accepted her as part of the strange new territory. He would follow her around the suite, his nose occasionally bumping against her hand. Sometimes, when Kaito slept, Alara would sit on the floor and stroke the dog's thick fur, her fingers sinking into the warmth of him. It was a small comfort, a reminder of a life where touch wasn't fraught with danger. She learned about him in fragments. Overheard whispers from his men in the hallway referred to him as the Oyabun, the boss. A news report on the television she was not supposed to be watching spoke of a brazen daylight attack on the head of the Ishikawa Gumi, a suspected casualty in a brewing territory war with the rival Hashimoto clan. She saw the way his men deferred to him, the way they entered the room with their heads bowed, their fear a palpable thing. He was a killer, a king in a violent, ruthless world. She should have been terrified. And she was. But her fear was mingled with a dangerous, unwelcome curiosity. She saw the way his long, elegant fingers would trace the patterns on the silk sheets, the calluses on his knuckles telling a different story than the platinum watch on his wrist. She noticed that he slept poorly, his rest disturbed by nightmares that made him twitch and clench his jaw. One night, she was startled awake from her doze in the armchair by a sound. A name, choked out in a raw, broken whisper. Akari. She was on her feet in an instant, her nursing instincts kicking in. But he wasn't in physical distress. He was thrashing in the throes of a dream, his face a mask of anguish she had never seen before. The cold control was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate grief. Akari, he murmured again, his hand reaching for something that wasn't there. Rai whined softly, nudging his master's hand with his wet nose. Allure stood frozen, feeling like an intruder on a sacred, private sorrow. This was his wound, the one vulnerability he carried. It was tied to a woman he had lost. The knowledge settled in her, heavy and unwanted. It made him human, and that was far more dangerous than the monster she had imagined. He woke with a gasp, his eyes flying open. They were wild for a second before they focused on her, and the mask of cold authority slammed back into place. But it was too late. She had seen behind it. The silence that followed was different. It was charged with what they both knew she had witnessed. The next day, the danger of his world breached the sterile walls of the hospital. She had just finished changing his dressing when a new orderly appeared at the door with a lunch tray. He was young, nervous, and didn't make eye contact. It was the last part that set off the alarm bells. Everyone made eye contact with Kaito Ishikawa. Rai sensed it first. A low growl started deep in his chest. Kaito's eyes narrowed, his body tensing. He said nothing, but the atmosphere in the room went from cold to arctic. The orderly stepped inside, his hand trembling as he set the tray down. Allure saw the glint of steel tucked into his waistband just as he made his move. It wasn't a gun. It was a knife, long and thin, and he lunged toward the bed with a desperate, clumsy speed. Time seemed to warp. Allure reacted without thinking, shoving the instrument cart into the assassin's path. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The man stumbled, his lunge thrown off balance. In that same instant, Kaito moved. He was out of the bed, his injured shoulder protesting but ignored, with a speed that was terrifying. He moved not like a man, but like a force of nature. He disarmed the attacker with two brutal, efficient strikes, the knife clattering to the floor. His men burst in from the hallway, alerted by the noise, and dragged the would-be assassin away. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Allure stood with her back pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the chaos, as his men had flooded the room, Kaito had moved to stand in front of her, his body a solid, immovable shield between her and the threat. He hadn't even looked at her, but the action was unmistakable, protective, possessive. He turned to her then, his amber eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and rough. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "You could have run. She could have." When the assassin stumbled, she could have fled the room, screamed for security, and never looked back. But she hadn't. She had stayed. She had pushed the cart. She had chosen a side. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You're my patient," she finally managed to say, the words sounding flimsy and hollow even to her own ears. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a cold, humorless thing. "Is that what I am?" The hospital was no longer safe. Within the hour, they were gone. A black, armored sedan spirited them away from the hospital's private exit to a place where walls were thicker and loyalty was absolute. Allure found herself in a penthouse apartment that occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, anonymous skyscraper in the heart of the city. The windows were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking, godlike view of the world below. It was beautiful. It was a cage. Her life was now confined to these rooms, surrounded by silent men and the constant, comforting presence of the dog. Kaido recovered quickly, his body healing with the same disciplined focus he applied to everything else. He began taking meetings in the large, minimalist living room, his lieutenants coming and going like shadows. Allure was confined to the other areas of the penthouse during these times, but the conversations, low and intense and in Japanese, bled through the walls. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone war. One afternoon, she walked into his office to retrieve a medical textbook she'd been reading. He wasn't there, but his laptop was open on the large obsidian desk. She knew she shouldn't look. It was a violation of his privacy, a boundary she had no right to cross. But she couldn't stop herself. On the screen was a file containing surveillance photos. A man with a cruel smile and a Hashimoto clan tattoo on his neck. He was pictured laughing in a restaurant, getting into a car, meeting with another man. The final photo in the sequence was different. It was taken in a dark alley. The man was on his knees, his face a mask of terror. The photo after that showed him lying on his back, eyes wide and sightless, a single, brutally precise wound in his chest. It was clean, surgical, lethal. It was Kaido's work. She knew it with a sickening certainty. This was the man she was caring for. This was the reality she had chosen to stay in. Bile rose in her throat. She should have run. She should have screamed. She should have done 1,000 things other than stand there, staring at the proof of his monstrousness. But as she looked at the dead man's face, she remembered the knife in the hospital room. The desperate lunge aimed at Kaido's heart. It was a world of kill or be killed. Kaido was simply better at it than anyone else. She closed the laptop, her hand trembling, and a part of her she didn't recognize felt not revulsion, but a grim, terrifying understanding. She had crossed a line in her own mind. She could never go back. The Hashimoto clan, having failed to kill Kaido, decided to target his perceived weakness. They targeted her. It happened during a supply run for fresh medical dressings, a trip she insisted on making with one of Kaido's drivers. A black sedan came out of nowhere, slamming into their car and sending them spinning across 3 lanes of traffic. It was a professional hit, meant to look like an accident. Her driver, a stoic man named Takeda, shielded her with his own body as the car crumpled around them. They survived, but the message was clear. When Kaido saw her back at the penthouse, a small cut on her temple from a shard of glass, the air crackled with a rage so cold it was almost silent. He walked toward her, his movements tight with control. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He simply reached out and gently brushed his thumb over the cut on her temple, his touch surprisingly soft. His eyes were blazing. "They will not touch you again," he said, and it was the most terrifying vow she had ever heard. The police came to question her. She sat in the gleaming white kitchen of the penthouse, 2 grim-faced detectives across the table from her. Kaido was in the other room, but she could feel his presence like a weight against her back. This was her chance. She could tell them everything. The attack, the man she was with, the war she had stumbled into. They could put her in witness protection. She could be free. But she thought of the dead man in the alley. She thought of the assassin in the hospital. She thought of Kaido's thumb, gentle against her skin, and the promise in his eyes. Telling the truth wouldn't save her. It would only paint a bigger target on her back and on everyone at St. Jude's. So she did the one thing she had never done in her life. She lied. She spun a tale of a reckless driver, a flash of headlights, a simple, tragic accident. She was calm, convincing, her nurses' training allowing her to recite the details with a detached credibility. The detectives bought it. As they left, she caught Kaido's eye from across the room. He gave her a single, slow nod. It was an acknowledgement, a seal on a pact she had just made in blood and lies. That night, she found him on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. The wind was cool against her skin. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had survived together. "Why did you lie?" he finally asked, his voice quiet. "Telling the truth wouldn't have kept me safe," she said, her own voice steady. "It just would have made the war messier." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the dark. "Everyone who looks at me sees the Oyabun, the head of the Ishikawagumi. A monster. A title." He took a step closer. "You, in that emergency room, you didn't see any of that. You saw a man with a dog." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession of a shared truth. "I told myself staying was just a job," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "That I was just doing my duty as a nurse. And now," he pressed, his voice a low velvet caress in the dark. She finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "Now I know I was lying to myself." The final confrontation came without warning. The Hashimoto clan, humiliated and desperate, launched a full-scale assault on the penthouse. The first sign was the explosion that rocked the floor below, followed by the shattering of the reinforced glass of the balcony doors. Chaos erupted. Kaido's men moved into formation, a disciplined unit against a tide of invaders. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. Kaido pushed Allure behind a large marble bar, handing her a small, heavy pistol. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice sharp. She watched as he moved through the fight. He was a whirlwind of deadly grace, his movements precise and economical. It was like watching a ballet of violence. But they were outnumbered. One of his men went down, then another. An attacker broke through their line, flanking Kaido, his gun raised. Kaido was engaged with two others. He didn't see him. Allure's mind went blank with terror, then focused with a startling clarity. She couldn't use the gun. She'd likely miss and hit one of their own. But there was another weapon in the room. Rai was at her side, snarling, his body vibrating with a desperate need to protect his master. She remembered Kaido's voice in the dead of night, the commands he used during their walks on the rooftop terrace. She leaned down, her mouth close to the dog's ear, and spoke a single, sharp Japanese word she had heard him use before. A command for a direct, unstoppable attack. "Ike, go." The dog shot out from behind the bar, like a black and tan missile. He hit the flanking gunman at full force, a blur of teeth and fury. The man screamed, his shot going wild as Rai's jaws clamped down on his arm. The distraction was all Kaido needed. He spun, his own weapon firing twice, and the threat was neutralized. The battle raged for another 10 minutes before the last of the Hashimoto attackers was subdued. Silence fell, thick with the smell of cordite and blood. The penthouse was a ruin of shattered glass and splintered furniture. Kaido walked over to the bar, his face grim. He looked down at her, then at Rai, who was now sitting at her side, panting, a low protective growl still rumbling in his chest. He looked at the pistol, still clutched in her white-knuckled hand. She had not been a passive victim waiting for rescue. She had acted. She had saved his life. He knelt in front of her, ignoring the chaos around them. He gently took the gun from her hand and set it aside. Then he took her hand, turning it palm up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carved piece of jade, a miniature wolf, and pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "In my world, loyalty is everything," he said, his voice raw. "It is the only currency that matters. You have shown more loyalty tonight than men who have sworn their lives to me." He looked at Rai, then back at her. "He listens to you. He is yours to command." He paused, his amber eyes holding hers captive. "As am I." It was an oath, a pledge of fealty from a king to his queen. It was more binding than any law, more intimate than any kiss. The cost of their victory was high. Takeda, the driver who had shielded her in the car, had not survived the attack. His death was a stark, brutal reminder that nothing in this world was free. The sun began to rise, casting long, golden fingers of light through the shattered windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Allure stood before the broken panorama of the city, the cool jade wolf heavy in her hand. Kaido came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, grounding force. Rai came and leaned against her legs, resting his heavy head on her thigh. She could leave. He would let her go now, she knew. He would give her a new life, anything she wanted. But as she looked out at the sprawling city below, a city that had tried to kill her, she felt no desire to run. She had walked into a dark, violent world, and instead of being consumed by it, she had found a strange, dangerous kind of peace. She had found a place where her calm was a weapon, her intelligence a shield, and her compassion a force that could gentle the most savage of beasts. She slowly unclenched her fist, looking at the jade wolf in her palm. Then, without a word, she slid her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive grip. It was not a surrender. It was a choice. Her choice. Here, in the ruins of their shared battle, with a killer at her side and a loyal beast at her feet, Allure Brooks was finally, terrifyingly, home.